On the 7th of May, 1925, a small private train rolled into a wooded station on the Wirral, carrying a coffin. Inside the village it served, the soap kettles had been switched off for the first time in 37 years. 800 brick cottages stood in silence behind their hedges. A choir of factory workers sang in the lane. The man inside the coffin had washed the British Empire. He had also, 4,000 miles away, signed his name to a system that flogged Congolese villagers for missing a quota of palm nuts. Both villages, the Model 1 and the Labour camp, came out of the same balance sheet. If you enjoy stories the history books cleaned up, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. The next 12 chapters take you behind the front gates of one of Britain's most beautiful villages and into the forest it was paid for with. Chapter 1. The Grocer Who Believed in Soap. In a Bolton grocery in 1874, a 15-year-old boy was already convinced that civilization could be sold by the pound. The boy was William Hesketh Lever. The grocery was on Wood Street, in the smoke and clatter of a Lancashire mill town that had grown rich on cotton and dirty on the cotton's byproducts. His father, James Lever, was a wholesale grocer of strict Congregationalist habits who weighed out flour, tea, soap and sugar by the hundredweight to small shopkeepers across the West Pennines. His mother, Eliza Hesketh, was the daughter of a cotton mill manager and a woman of quiet, biblical certainty. William was the 7th of 10 children and the eldest surviving son. He left school at 15 and joined his father's business as an apprentice on a starting wage of 5 shillings a week. What he learned in those first years was not chemistry. It was the discipline of cash. The trade was a thin one. A grocer marked up his goods by a few pennies, paid his own bills by month, and lived or fell on the speed at which his stock turned over. James Lever ran a cash business. There was no credit on the books and no slow payers on the ledger. William's first lesson, repeated daily, was that the man who turned over his stock fastest made the most money, even when his margin was the smallest. He never forgot it. Outside the warehouse, he was an extraordinary creature. He rose at 5 in the morning all his life. He read in the dark hours before breakfast. He took a cold bath every morning, in summer and winter, and slept all his adult life in an open-air bedroom on the top floor of whichever house he owned, with the windows propped permanently open and a roof over his head only on the worst nights. He went to chapel 3 times on Sundays. He sang in the choir at Bank Street Independent Chapel. He neither drank nor smoked. He believed, almost without doubting, that hard work, cold water, clean linen, and the Old Testament were enough to remake any human being. When he married Elizabeth Ellen Hume on the 17th of April 1874, he married a woman he had known since infancy. They had walked to the same chapel as children. She was steady where he was driven, quiet where he was loud, charitable where he was directive, and devout in the same Congregationalist way. They moved into a small terraced house in Bolton. Elizabeth would never have a household of her own choosing again. From the moment of her marriage, she lived in houses William picked, decorated, and ran. She gave him one son, William Hume Lever, born in 1888. She left almost no other public mark on his life, and yet he loved her with an absolute loyalty until the day of her death. By 1884, William was 33 years old and chafing under his father. He had already added new lines to the family wholesale business, including soap, which he bought from the smaller Lancashire soap works in unmarked blocks. Branded soap, of the kind we know today, did not really exist. A grocer ordered a bar of soft yellow soap from a soaper, cut it on his counter, and sold it by the pound to housewives who used it for everything from washing pots to bathing babies. The soap was inconsistent in colour, in scent, in lather, in weight. Sometimes it was cut with chalk, sometimes it ran grey. The whole trade was an old and unimpressive one. Lever saw an opportunity. He believed that a soap consistent enough, clean enough, and pretty enough to put a name on would beat the unbranded trade out of the grocer's drawer. He persuaded his brother James Darcy Lever to join him, leased a small soap works at Warrington from a firm called Windsor and Company for the sum of £4,000 advanced by their father, and set up Lever Brothers in June of that year. The Warrington Works was a modest set of brick sheds beside the Mersey Ship Canal. It had 4 soap pans, a packing room, a small office, and roughly 20 workmen. William knew almost nothing about soap chemistry. What he knew was the grocer's counter, the cash book, and the imagination of the housewife. To make the soap, he hired a Bolton chemist named William Hoof Watson. Watson, a quiet man with a beard, was already experimenting with a formulation that used vegetable oils instead of tallow. He produced for Lever a free lathering yellow bar, slightly mottled in appearance, which Lever named at first Honey Soap, then renamed Sunlight Soap. Sunlight was registered as a trademark on the 4th of November 1884, the first packaged household soap brand in Britain. By the end of that year, the first cartons were being printed in Bolton, and the first bars were being cut at uniform 16-ounce weights, wrapped in greaseproof imitation parchment, and dispatched in coloured boxes to grocers across Lancashire and Cheshire. Within the year, the Warrington Works could not keep up. Within 3 years, Sunlight Soap was a national name. Within 10, it was sold in 50 countries. This is where almost every account of William Lever begins, with a quiet Lancashire grocer turned soap king. But the real beginning is colder. It is in the discipline of the cash book. It is in the conviction that civilization could be branded, packaged, weighed, stamped, and sold. The Bolton grocery did not raise a saint. It raised a man who would spend the next 40 years insisting that the world could be improved, if only it would buy what he was selling. Chapter 2. The Bar That Sold the Empire. Before Sunlight, soap was a brown lump on a string in a damp grocer's drawer. Watson's Bar changed that. It was made from palm oil and copra, both vegetable oils, rather than the animal tallow that had formed the basis of British soap for 2 centuries. The vegetable oils produced a soap that lathered more easily, washed clothes cleaner, and left less of the rancid smell that tallow soaps acquired in warm weather. The bar's mottled appearance came from the way Watson worked his lye. The strange yellow colour came from the palm oil. The smell, faintly floral, came from a trace of citronella. The packaging was almost more important than the soap. Lever had the bars cut to a uniform 16-ounce weight, wrapped first in greaseproof imitation parchment, then in a coloured paper carton printed in red and yellow with the word Sunlight in block letters and a small picture of a sunny cottage. The bar inside was indistinguishable from the bar in the next shop. It always weighed the same, lathered the same, smelled the same. For the first time in the history of British retail, a housewife in Glasgow could buy the same soap as a housewife in Bristol and be certain it would behave the same on washing day. Lever invested in advertising on a scale no British grocer had ever attempted. He bought front pages of provincial newspapers and the colour back pages of weekly magazines. He printed posters by the thousand. He paid for tin enamel signs, the kind that bolted to railway station walls, advertising sunlight against pictures of healthy children. He invented a competition called the Sunlight Soap Yearbook, in which housewives sent in wrappers in exchange for cash prizes, and which generated more than 600,000 responses in its first year. He commissioned the Royal Academy painter William Powell Frith to produce promotional pictures. He spent on advertising, in his peak years before 1910, around £40,000 a year. an amount that would now be worth several £1 million. He treated the buying public not as the polite middle-class market the older soap firms targeted, but as a national audience of millions, every one of whom should know the brand. Demand outran the works inside 3 years. By 1887, the Warrington plant could produce around 450 tons of soap a week, and even that was not enough. Lever began to look across the Mersey. On the Wirral side of the river, on the muddy creek country between Bebington and Bromborough, there was open land, a deep water dock at Bromborough Pool, a connection to the Birkenhead Railway, and proximity to the imported palm oil arriving at Liverpool. In 1987, he bought 56 acres of land at Bromborough at roughly £250 an acre, with an option to extend. He laid out the new factory, then immediately began to lay out something stranger beside it. He believed that the factory and the village should be planned together. He had visited the Cadbury works at Bourneville, which George Cadbury had begun in 1879. He knew Titus Salt's Saltaire near Bradford. He had read about Robert Owen's new Lanark experiment of 1808. He did not want a barracks. He did not want a slum. He wanted, in his own phrase, to share with his workers the profits of their labour by giving them better houses than they could otherwise afford. He wanted a village so attractive that every grocer in Britain, when he looked at a wrapped bar of sunlight, would know that the soap inside had been made by happy men. On the 3rd of March, 1888, Elizabeth Lever cut the first sod on the new site with a silver spade. Within months, Bromborough Pool had become Port Sunlight. Within a year, the factory was producing 15,000 tons of soap a year. Within a decade, the company had outgrown its Warrington origins entirely. Within 20 years, Sunlight soap was sold in over 50 countries, in cartons printed in dozens of languages. By 1910, Lever Brothers was the largest soap manufacturer in the world. But Sunlight was only the start. Lever launched Lifebuoy Royal Disinfectant Soap in 1894, a red carbolic bar marketed at families terrified of diphtheria and typhoid. He launched Lux Flakes in 1900, the first soap designed not for laundry tubs, but for fine fabrics, washed by hand. He bought Pears Soap in 1917, after holding its rival Vinolia for several years. He acquired Knight's Castile, Watson's Matchless Cleanser, Hudson's Soap of Liverpool, and a string of smaller Lancashire makers, until by 1925, Lever Brothers controlled more than 2/3 of the British branded soap market. Sunlight changed the British home. It changed the British grocer. It changed the British advertising industry. It changed what a working-class housewife expected of a soap, and it changed what a soap company could expect of itself. By the late 1890s, Lever was no longer a Bolton grocer. He was a national figure, an industrialist of the new model, a man around whom rumours of riches and quiet philanthropy were already gathering. He had also become something less visible. He had become an employer of thousands, with opinions about how those thousands should live. The 56 muddy acres at Bromborough Pool were about to become the most carefully engineered village in Britain. Chapter 3. The village born from a bar of soap. In March of 1888, Lever cut a sod of clay on the Wirral and called it Port Sunlight. The land was nothing to look at. It was a stretch of brackish creek country between Bebington and Bromborough, drained by sluggish streams and overshadowed by the chimneys of nearby gasworks. Lever saw past the mud. He saw avenues. He saw rows of brick cottages. He saw a Congregationalist church on a rise. He saw a temperance inn. He saw a swimming bath. He saw a school. He saw behind it all the factory whose chimneys would feed the houses, and whose profits would pay for everything else. The architecture, from the start, was different. Most factory villages of the period were terraced rows of identical houses, built by company contractors to the cheapest specification a Victorian landlord could justify. Port Sunlight was the opposite. Lever hired the Warrington architect William Owen to design the factory and the earliest cottages, then opened the village to a roster of leading arts and crafts architects. Over the next 30 years, around 30 different firms contributed designs. The result is a village in which no two adjacent blocks are alike. There are houses in red ruabon, brick with steep tiled roofs. There are houses in rough cast white render with timbered gables. There are houses with leaded mullions, with carved stone porches, with Dutch gables, with shaped chimneys, with thatched eaves. The streets curve. The gardens are deep. The whole village is laid out on a grid of axes that meet at small green squares with trees and stone benches. By 1914, there were approximately 800 dwellings on 130 acres of land. The houses were not identical, but they were rigorously similar in standard. Every cottage had its own front and back garden. Every cottage had an indoor bathroom, a kitchen with a coal range, a parlour, and 3 or 4 bedrooms above. Every cottage had its own front door, opening straight onto the street in the English vernacular of independence, rather than the continental tenement style of shared stair. None of the houses were tall. None of them were grand. They were all, in the architectural sense, small and considered. Around the houses, Lever built a complete township in miniature. The Bridge Inn opened in 1890, an oak-panelled public house with stained glass windows. At Lever's insistence, the Bridge served no alcohol for its first 15 years, until a referendum among the residents in 1903 voted by a margin of 2-1 to allow beer. The Sulgrave Institute opened as a women's gathering and education hall. The Hume Hall dining rooms, named after Elizabeth, fed unmarried Port Sunlight women in their own dignified setting. The Gladstone Theatre opened in 1891 and became the village's main hall for lectures and plays. The Lyceum, the open-air swimming pool, the open-air gymnasia, the cottage hospital, the bowling green, the tennis courts, and the allotments all followed. By 1904, an undenominational Christ Church was completed, with a tower modelled loosely on Magdalen College, Oxford. The 2 large schools, the Technical Institute and the War Memorial, designed by Sir William Goscombe John and unveiled in 1921, completed the public buildings. Then, beside it all, came the gallery. The Lady Lever Art Gallery, designed by William and Segar Owen, opened in December of 1922. Princess Beatrice cut the ribbon. Inside, in 20 galleries arranged around a central pantheon, Lever installed his own collection. There were pre-Raphaelite paintings by Rossetti, Holman Hunt, and Burne-Jones. There were portraits by Reynolds, Romney, and Gainsborough. There were Wedgwood jasperware pieces by the thousand. There was Chinese export porcelain. There was Greek and Roman sculpture. There were full sets of English furniture by Chippendale and Sheraton. The gallery was free to enter, and it was open to the public from the day it opened. The scale paragraph for Port Sunlight as it stood in 1924 reads like a small empire. The village covered 130 acres. It contained around 890 dwellings, of which today over 900 individual buildings are listed. It housed approximately 3,500 people, of whom about 4,000 worked in the factory at peak shifts. The Sunlight Works that year produced 134,000 tons of soap a year, more than any other factory on Earth. The village had its own newspaper, The Progress, its own brass band, its own choir, its own football team, its own savings bank, its own cooperative store, its own library of more than 10,000 volumes. and its own gallery containing several hundred pre-Raphaelite works. To outsiders, the village was an astonishment. Foreign delegations arrived almost every week. Henry Ford toured Port Sunlight in 1907 and took ideas back to Detroit. Japanese trade commissioners studied the housing layout for the new model towns being planned around Tokyo. American factory reformers measured the rooms and copied the floor plans for company towns in Pennsylvania and Ohio. King George V and Queen Mary visited in 1914, walked the avenues with Elizabeth and William, inspected the schools and the church, and signed the visitors' book at Hume Hall. Edward, Prince of Wales, came in 1921. The Belgian King Albert I, with whom Lever had by then signed a very different contract, was a regular visitor in private. Inside the village, life looked like the brochure. Children walked to school across landscaped greens. Women carried laundry baskets along wide paved pavements with no horse traffic. Men in three-piece suits walked from the factory gate to their front gardens in 15 minutes. The village had a low infant mortality rate, far lower than the surrounding Liverpool slums. It had a literacy rate close to 100%. It had no licensed beer house until 1903, and no public drunkenness recorded by the company welfare officers until the late 1920s. For a moment, in the first quarter of the 20th century, it looked as if Lever had solved the most painful problem of the industrial age. He had built a factory, whose workers lived in cottages, owned books, raised healthy children, and walked through a park to look at pre-Raphaelite paintings on their afternoons off. He had done it on the profits of a single brand of yellow soap, and he had done it without a single shilling of charity. Every penny of the village had been paid for, in Lever's own description, out of soap. That was the dream, as the village reached its peak. The next half of the story is what the dream cost. The first cost was inside the village itself, in a clause of every tenancy agreement that no visitor in his three-piece suit was ever shown. Chapter 4. The lease that owned your life. Every house in Port Sunlight was leased only for as long as you obeyed. There was no Port Sunlight homeowner. There was no Port Sunlight freehold cottage. There was no Port Sunlight pensioner whose grandchildren would one day inherit the front parlour. There was only the Lever brothers' tenancy agreement, which granted the use of the house for as long as the tenant remained an employee of the company, and which lapsed at the day his employment ended. A worker dismissed at the gate for drunkenness, attempted unionisation, sexual irregularity, persistent absence, refusal to follow a foreman's order, or for any other reason at the foreman's discretion, lost his house at the same instant he lost his wage. The clause was not invisible. Lever did not hide it. He defended it openly. He believed, with the same certainty he brought to everything else, that the right to live in a Port Sunlight cottage should be tied to the right to work in a Port Sunlight factory. He argued that this was not a punishment, but a privilege. He pointed out that no one was forced to live in the village. Workers could, if they preferred, take a cottage in nearby Tranmere or Birkenhead and walk to the gate from outside. They would lose their share of the prosperity sharing, but they would also lose his clauses. The choice was theirs. In practice, the choice was not as open as he made it sound. The cottages were the best housing available to a working-class family within walking distance of the factory. Tranmere and Birkenhead, in the 1890s and the 1900s, were courtyard slums by comparison. To turn down a Port Sunlight cottage was to turn down a bath, a small back garden, an inside lavatory, a parlour, and a place at the village school for your children. A Port Sunlight tenancy was, in working-class Liverpool terms, the difference between being respectable and being not respectable. So most men accepted the cottage and the clauses together. The clauses were enforced by the welfare officers. These were not policemen. They were not strangers. They were, in most cases, the unmarried sisters, daughters, or nieces of senior managers, employed by the company at modest stipends to walk the village and check that all was well. They had the right to enter any cottage during the day to confirm that the floors were scrubbed, the children sent to school, the front garden tended, the lavatory clean, the parlour furniture undamaged, and the windows free of dust. They had a kind word for the loyal tenant. They had a quiet report for the disloyal one. Drink was the first front of the battle. The Bridge Inn served no alcohol for 15 years after it opened. Lever, a lifelong teetotaler, regarded drink as the single greatest enemy of working-class progress. When the residents finally voted in 1903 to allow beer at the bridge, he submitted to the result. But he never approved of it. The factory itself remained dry. The works' canteens served only tea, coffee, and lemonade. Any worker found drunk on shift was dismissed at once, and a worker found drunk in his cottage on a Friday night could find himself spoken to by a welfare officer on the Saturday morning. The company kept records of such conversations. Sex was the second front. The village had a strikingly low number of illegitimate births recorded. Some of this was the cost of birth control practiced in respectable working-class households. Some of it was the cost of fear. A young, unmarried woman who became visibly pregnant could expect to lose her job at the wrapping table by the end of the same week. A married woman who became pregnant could expect to lose her job when she showed. Female workers, almost all employed in the wrapping and packing departments, were paid less than half the male rate. They were dismissed automatically on marriage. The company saw no contradiction in this. Marriage was a man's responsibility. The woman's wage was unnecessary once the man's wage came home. Unions were the third front. Lever did not recognize trade unions inside Port Sunlight throughout his lifetime. He believed in the bond between master and man as a direct one. He believed that the man who shared the profits with his employees did not require an intermediary. There were, accordingly, no shop stewards inside the factory and no recognized union officials in the works. The Trade Union Act of 1913 permitted unions to organize, but Lever simply declined to negotiate with them. A worker who attempted to organize his fellow workers could expect a quiet warning from his foreman the first time, a transfer to a poorer department the second time, and dismissal the third. The cottage tenancy lapsed at dismissal. The cottage lapsed. The school lapsed. The cooperative store membership lapsed. The village football team membership lapsed. A man's whole social existence collapsed at the same moment as his wage. The third front was the most powerful. Many years later, when sociologists came to write about Port Sunlight, they noticed something striking. The village had the lowest strike rate of any industrial settlement in Britain. It had almost no recorded union activity. It had a remarkably stable workforce, with many families staying through 3 or 4 generations. This was sometimes presented as evidence of the village's success. It was as much evidence of its discipline. Men who would have struck in Liverpool did not strike in Port Sunlight. They could not afford to. Below this, the parallel domestic service hierarchy at Lever's own house operated on the same lines, but at higher pay. Thornton Manor, Lever's 7 miles inland country house, employed an indoor staff of about 24. The wage book for 1910 records the butler at £120 a year all found, the housekeeper at £75, the cook at £60, footman at £30, ladies' maids at £28, kitchen maids at £16, scullery maids at £12, and a hall boy at £8 with shoes. These wages, against a London labourer's wage of about £50 a year without bed or board, were good. Domestic service at Thornton was a sought-after position, but it was service. Behind the green baize door on the ground floor, A separate world existed. Below stairs, there was a steward's room for the upper servants, who dined apart from the hall. There was a separate servants' hall for the under-servants, with its own oak table and its own simpler menu. There was an attic floor of servant bedrooms with shared washing, accessed by a back staircase. There were bell wires running through the back staircase walls that allowed any room in the house to summon a footman within a minute. The servants ate at 6 in the morning, served the family breakfast at 9, served lunch at 1, served tea at 4, served dinner at 8, and were dismissed at 11 if there were no guests. There was a daily inspection of livery by the butler. There was a weekly inspection of bedrooms by the housekeeper. There was an annual full week of holiday, which most servants spent travelling home to see their parents. This was the texture of paternalism. It was real. It was generous compared to the alternatives. It was also absolute. A Port Sunlight man, a Thornton parlourmaid, and a Bromborough soaper all worked for the same man. The wage was different, but the conditions were structurally identical. Each of them lived in a house, slept under a roof, ate at a table, and drew a wage controlled at every important point by William Hesketh Lever. There was no second employer. There was no second landlord. There was no second authority. There was only Lever. In 1906, that authority was challenged for the first time. The challenge did not come from Port Sunlight or from Thornton Manor. It came from London, from a newspaper that did not believe him. Chapter 5. The Soap Trust and the Daily Mail. In 1906, the Daily Mail decided that the king of soap was a thief. The accusation was not original. By that year, every British soap manufacturer of any size was worried about a single problem. The raw material cost of palm oil and copra had risen sharply during the early years of the new century, partly because demand had grown faster than supply, partly because shipping costs had risen, partly because new German and Belgian buyers had entered the market. The price the British public paid for a bar of household soap had not risen with it. The margins in the trade were being squeezed from both ends. Lever, characteristically, decided to fix the problem by reorganizing the industry. In the early summer of 1906, he convened a meeting at his London offices of the heads of the principal British soap firms. Sitting around the table were representatives of Pears, Vinolia, Watsons, Knights, Hudsons, Crossfields, and his own Lever brothers. The proposal was simple and stark. The firms would combine into a single trust. They would standardize the weight of their bars and the prices at which they were sold. They would reduce advertising. They would share raw material buying through a central syndicate, which would suppress competition between them in the world palm oil markets. The savings, Lever argued, would benefit the public through lower retail prices and the firms through higher and more reliable margins. Several of the firms agreed in principle. Crossfields, the largest of the rival Lancashire soapers, signed an outline. Pears signed a letter of intention. Watsons joined the talks. Knights was sympathetic. Hudson's was the largest holdout. The Liverpool press, watching the negotiations, began to write about a soap trust. The Daily Mail, the largest-selling daily newspaper in Britain, edited under the close personal direction of Alfred Harmsworth, the future Lord Northcliffe, decided that the soap trust was a public scandal. The Mail's attack began on the 29th of October 1906. It was sustained, repeated, and devastating. Lever, the paper said, was hoarding raw material. He was shortening the weight of his bars. He was crushing the small soapers. He was raising prices behind a fake combination. He was inventing a monopoly. He was forming a trust of the American kind, with all the rapacity and none of the discipline of the American originals. The Mail's circulation rose. Within weeks, half a dozen other Harmsworth papers, including the Daily Mirror and the Evening News, joined the attack. public reaction was severe. Wrappers were burned in the streets of working-class districts. Sunlight soap sales fell. The London grocery trade reported, in the autumn of 1906, a measurable drop in branded soap demand. The Soap Trust collapsed before it had legally formed. By the end of 1906, the participating firms had withdrawn their letters of intention. Crossfields had pulled out. Peers had pulled out. Hudson's had pulled out. The trust idea was, in commercial terms, dead. Lever sued. He sued the Daily Mail. He sued the Daily Mirror. He sued the Evening News. He sued the Manchester Daily Dispatch. He sued the Liverpool Daily Post. He sued the Star. He sued the Newcastle Chronicle. By the end of 1906, he had 30 separate libel actions in train against the Harmsworth papers and their satellites. The cases were taken to the Liverpool Assizes in July of 1907, beginning with the principal action against the Mail. Lever's leading counsel was Sir Edward Carson, the Dublin-born lawyer who was simultaneously prosecuting Oscar Wilde's archives in the West End and defending Ulster Protestant interests at Westminster. Carson opened on the 17th of July, 1907. The Mail's defence was led by Sir Rufus Isaacs, the future Lord Reading, with Henry Duke, the future Lord Merivale, as his junior. The case lasted 3 days. On the third day, the Mail's defence collapsed. Sir Rufus Isaacs withdrew the plea of justification. The agreed damages were £50,000, the largest sum ever awarded for libel in a British court at that date. Lever was paid. The other actions followed. By the autumn of 1907, the total recovered ran to roughly £91,000, equivalent to several £1,000,000 in modern money. Carson alone was paid an extraordinary fee for his 3 days' work. The remainder went into the Lever brothers' reserves and was, by his own later admission, used to fund the next phase of corporate expansion. Lever was vindicated. Northcliffe sent an emissary in late 1907 to apologise. The two men were never reconciled. The libel war did 3 things to Lever. First, it confirmed his belief that he was right and his critics were either fools or scoundrels. He had, in his own view, proven this in court. The largest libel verdict on record had been awarded in his favour. He came out of the case with the public face of a wronged industrialist vindicated by the law. Second, it gave him money he had not had before, money which he did not need for the running of the existing business, and which he could direct into new ventures. Third, and most lasting, it removed any check on his autocracy. The British press had attacked him and lost. From 1907 onward, no British newspaper of weight criticised Lever's policies again for almost a decade. There is a counterfactual question that hangs over the Soap Trust episode. What might have happened if the Daily Mail had not attacked Lever, and if the British Soap Trust had quietly formed in the autumn of 1906? It is possible that the British soap industry would have consolidated a generation earlier than it did. It is possible that the cartel would have raised retail prices, as the Mail predicted. It is also possible that it would have stabilised the trade. We will never know. The trust did not form. Lever paid Carson and put his money into reserves. He looked for somewhere new to put the soap business. By the end of 1907, he was looking abroad. By 1909, he was buying coconut plantations in the Solomon Islands. By 1911, his eye had moved further, to the Belgian Congo, where a new colonial government, fresh from the disgrace of Leopold's rubber regime, was looking for foreign investors who would do better. The Soap Trust money funded the first survey trip. The libel damages from the Daily Mail funded the early concession negotiations. The judgment of Liverpool Assizes, in this strange and indirect way, funded the founding of the Huileries du Congo Belge. There is a deep irony in that chain. The Daily Mail accused Lever in 1906 of becoming a monopolist who would crush the British market. Lever sued, won, and used the damages to build a far worse monopoly than the one the Mail had imagined. He built it not in Lancashire, where Northcliffe's reporters could see him, but 4,000 miles south, in a forest where there were no reporters at all. Chapter 6. The Concession in the Forest. In 1911, a Bolton grocer signed his name to a tract of African forest the size of Wales. The signature was witnessed at the Royal Palace in Brussels. The document was drawn up in French. The other signature on the document was that of King Albert I of the Belgians. The land described in the contract was 750,000 hectares of forest in the Belgian Congo, mostly south of the town of Bandundu on the Kwilu River. The currency was the Belgian franc. The company was a new Belgian subsidiary of Lever Brothers, called the Huileries du Congo Belge, with a paid-up capital of 75 million Belgian francs and a board on which Lever men held the controlling majority. The history that lay behind that contract was one of the worst in modern empire. Until 1908, the Congo had been the personal possession of King Leopold II of the Belgians, a private fief disguised as a humanitarian project. Under Leopold, between roughly 1890 and 1908, the rubber regime in the Congo killed an estimated 5 to 10 million Africans through forced labor, mutilation, starvation, and disease. The scale of the dying eventually broke through into the British press, principally through Edmund Dean Morel and the Congo Reform Association, and through Roger Casement's consular report of 1903. In 1908, under sustained international pressure, the Belgian state took over the Congo from Leopold. The new Belgian Congo was supposed to be different. The new colonial regime promised the abolition of forced labor, the regulation of concessions, the provision of medical care, and the protection of African subsistence economies. It announced itself as a moral improvement on what had gone before. It was into this newly cleaned colonial regime that Lever proposed to invest. He had been thinking about West Africa since the early 1900s. The cost of palm oil had been rising. The German, French, and Belgian competition for raw material was growing. He had tried first to buy plantations in Nigeria, but the British Colonial Office, alarmed by the implications of giving a Lancashire industrialist a monopoly over a British colony's principal export, had refused. He had tried the Cameroons under German rule. He had tried the Solomon Islands and the New Hebrides and bought coconut plantations there. But the scale was insufficient. The Congo, with its enormous palm forests and a desperate new government in Brussels, offered what no other tropical colony could. The negotiations were conducted in 1910 and 1911. Lever met King Albert in person at the Royal Palace in Brussels. He met the Minister of Colonies, Jules Renkin, repeatedly. He gave evidence to the Belgian Colonial Council. He made, in the Belgian press of 1910, a case that became famous in Belgian colonial circles. He argued that the Congo's palm forests were currently exploited by what he called itinerant African labor, which gathered nuts inefficiently from the wild trees, sold them cheaply to local middlemen, and produced an oil too dirty for industrial use. He proposed to replace this with what he called rational exploitation. Lever Brothers would build mills. They would build company towns. They would pay cash wages. They would educate workers in the techniques of cultivation. They would provide medical care, schools, churches, and clean drinking water. In return, they would receive an exclusive concession to harvest palm oil in defined circles around their mills, with the right to claim labor from those circles at agreed rates. The Belgian government agreed. The contract was signed in April of 1911. The Huileries du Congo Belge was formally incorporated. The concession covered 5 great circles centered on 5 new mill sites. The largest of these was at a place on the Kwilu River that the Belgian colonial cartographers initially called nothing in particular. Lever ordered it renamed. From 1912 onward, the new company town was called Leverville. The other mill sites were at Brabanta, Alberta, Elizabetha and Basongo. Together they covered 750,000 hectares, roughly 1,900,000 acres, which is larger than the whole of Yorkshire, almost the size of Wales. On paper, the original plan was benevolent. Lever had built Port Sunlight, he had built the Bridge Inn, he had built Christ Church, he had built the Gladstone Theatre. He proposed to build, in the rainforest of the Kwilu, a new Port Sunlight for the Congolese. The workers' housing at Liverville was planned along lines borrowed from the Wirral. There would be brick-built quarters, with windows and verandas. There would be a hospital. There would be a school for the Catholic children of the workers, run by the Shootist missionaries. There would be a company shop. There would be a small cinema for evening entertainment. There would be a church with a Belgian priest. Lever told his shareholders that the Congolese worker, after a few years inside the rational exploitation system, would emerge as a sober, literate, Christian wage earner, indistinguishable except in colour from a Port Sunlight man. The reality, from the very first months, was different. Recruitment was the problem. The local Pende, Yansi, Mbun, and Yaka peoples of the Kwilu Basin had their own subsistence economy. They cultivated cassava and millet. They hunted. They fished in the river. They harvested palm nuts in a seasonal way, from the wild trees in the forest, for their own use and for sale in small quantities to local traders. They did not see the appeal of leaving their villages to work 12 hours a day in a Belgian mill for a wage in unfamiliar currency. By the end of 1912, the Huileries du Congo Belge had built its first mill at Leverville and could find almost no one to work in it. The company turned to the Belgian colonial administration for help. The administration, eager to make the new investment succeed, agreed. It already had in place a system, inherited from the Leopoldian period and modified after 1908, of recognizing African chiefs, paying them a small subsidy, and recruiting young men from their villages through them. From 1913 onward, this chefferie system was turned, in the Lever circles, towards labour supply for the company. Chiefs were instructed to deliver a quota of men. Those men were marched to the mill. They were given numbers on metal tags. They were housed in barracks. They were paid in francs, which they could only spend at the company shop. They were registered as employees of the Huileries du Congo Belge. In 1914, the system was disrupted by the outbreak of the First World War. The British market for palm oil and glycerin exploded. Lever brothers received vast wartime contracts. The Belgian Congo, although not directly invaded, was cut off in part from Brussels and operated in much greater autonomy. The colonial state pressed harder for wartime output. The labour regime tightened. By 1917, the Belgian government was issuing orders explicitly directing local administrators to support the labour recruitment efforts of the Huileries du Congo Belge by any means necessary. By 1922, a Belgian decree made it a criminal offence, punishable by 2 to 3 months' imprisonment, for any Congolese worker contracted to a concession company to fail to deliver his quota of palm nuts. Forced labour, formally abolished by the Belgian colonial charter, had been reintroduced in everything but name. By that point, Sunlight soap, sold in cartons across the British Empire, contained palm oil that had increasingly been cut by Congolese men working under a regime of criminal sanction. The cartons did not say so. The visitors to Port Sunlight did not see it. The villagers themselves had no way of knowing. The two systems, the one on the Wirral and the one on the Kwilu, had been carefully arranged so that they never met inside the same conversation. The moment a model village turned into a colony was the moment the first quota became a prison sentence. The next chapter is what that sentence looked like. 4,000 miles south of Liverpool, in a place where no British inspector ever came. Chapter 7. The Quotas at Leverville. At a roadside mill on the Kwilu River, a quota became a prison sentence. We know this in detail today because of one man, the Belgian historian Jules Marchal, a former colonial administrator who had served in the Congo in the 1940s and 1950s, spent the last 30 years of his life researching the Lever Concession from the inside. Marchal had access to the Belgian colonial archives and to the records of the Huileries du Congo Belge at the Lever brothers' head office. He published his findings in French in 4 volumes during the 1990s. The English version, published by Verso in 2008 under the title Lord Leverhume's Ghosts, draws on more than 100,000 pages of primary source material, including company memoranda, Belgian colonial reports, missionary correspondence, and the registers of the local prison houses. The labour regime that Marchal documented was savage. The chefferie supply system was the foundation. Every Belgian colonial commissioner in the Lever circles was given a quota of men to deliver. The commissioner passed the quota down to the chiefs. The chiefs, paid by the colonial state and increasingly dependent on company favour, identified the men. The men were marched. The marches were sometimes overnight. The recruits were sometimes tied at the wrists. They were registered at the mill, issued with a metal tag bearing a number, housed in long barracks of beaten earth and corrugated iron, and put to work cutting palm fruit from the wild trees. Work was paid by output. A man was required to deliver a fixed quantity of palm nut fruit per month, varying between 30 and 50 bunches, depending on the year and the mill. A bunch could weigh between 15 and 40 kilograms. A man who delivered his quota was paid in cash. A man who fell short was punished. The punishments in the early years were administrative. By the late 1910s, they had become physical. By the 1920s, after the decree of 1922, they had become criminal. A man could be sentenced by a Belgian colonial magistrate on a complaint from a company foreman to 2 to 3 months of imprisonment with hard labour for failing to deliver his quota. The prison itself was often a company building, with hard labour performed at the same mill from which the prisoner had originally tried to escape. Flogging was widespread, although officially forbidden. The chicotte, a whip of hippopotamus hide that had been the instrument of the Leopoldian regime, continued in informal use into the 1930s under the new colonial state. Marchal documents specific incidents at Leverville, at Brabanta, and at Elizabetha. He documents the names of foremen, the names of victims, the names of Belgian magistrates who issued sentences, and the names of company officials who received reports. He documents missionary protests sent to the Brussels offices, including a report from the Schoutist priest, Father Vermiche, that reached the Belgian colonial minister in 1924. The medical conditions were lethal. Sleeping sickness, the trypanosomiasis spread by the tsetse fly, swept through the work camps from the early 1910s onward. The barracks at Leverville were built in poorly drained areas where the fly was endemic. The work in the wild palm groves took men deep into infested forest. Marchal reports mortality rates in the Lever camps during the worst years of the 1910s at 20 to 30% per year. Other diseases followed. Dysentery, hookworm, malaria, tuberculosis, and influenza killed others. The wartime 1918 and 1919 influenza pandemic emptied entire barracks. The company did build a small hospital at Leverville from 1912 onward, and a dispensary at each other mill. The Shootist missionaries operated their own infirmaries. But the medical infrastructure was tiny compared to the scale of the deaths. Wirral documents specific years in which more men died at Leverville than were recruited. The financial settlements were lopsided. A Congolese palm cutter at Leverville in 1915 was paid, when paid, around 50 centimes a day. A Lancashire soper at Port Sunlight in the same year was paid roughly 4 to 5 shillings a day. A Belgian functionary in the colonial administration was paid roughly 15 to 20 francs a day. The wages of a Congolese cutter, even on Belgian colonial reckoning, were a small fraction of those of his European supervisors. He had no return ticket. He had no pension. He had no medical insurance. He had only the next month's quota. If he reached it, he was paid. If he did not, he was charged. The company defended its system. Lever, in board meetings, argued repeatedly that the Huileries du Congo Belge was a benevolent improvement on the Leopoldian rubber regime. He pointed out that no one in his circles was being mutilated. He pointed out that the Shootist missionaries were running schools and chapels. He pointed out that the company had built hospitals. He pointed out that wages, although small, were higher than the local subsistence average. He visited the Congo in person in 1924 and 1925, in the last months of his life, and toured Leverville and Elizabetha. He recorded in his journal that the Africans seemed contented and that the mills were well run. He died in May 1925 with that account on the books of his memory. Other witnesses thought otherwise. The Belgian Marxist novelist and journalist Charles Plisnier visited Leverville in 1924. He wrote of barracks where men slept on bare earth floors. He wrote of foremen carrying truncheons. He wrote of the silence in the company shop, where the only currency was the company franc and the only goods were tinned milk, kerosene, and cheap cotton. The English missionary J. H. Harris of the Anti-Slavery and Aborigines Protection Society visited 2 of the Lever circles in 1927, 2 years after Lever's death, and reported in the Society's quarterly journal that he had seen conditions little different in kind from those of the Leopoldian era, with the addition of better paperwork. Harris was deeply religious, politically conservative, and ideologically sympathetic to the principle of European colonization. His judgment was therefore unusually painful to read. By the time the public accounting began, Lever was already dead. The Huileries du Congo Belge continued to operate through the 1930s under the management of his successors. The decrees were slowly relaxed. Wages slowly rose. The criminal penalty for missing a quota was formally abolished in 1947. The full transition to free wage labour did not come until the late 1950s and the run-up to Congolese independence in 1960. By that date, the company had been operating in the Kwilu forest for nearly half a century, on a labour system that even its own defenders would later describe as legally forced. This is the human cost of cheap sunlight soap. It is hard to quantify directly. There is no neat figure of fatalities because the Belgian colonial state did not keep one. There is no list of names. There is instead an absence. There are villages on the Kwilu River from which men were taken in the 1910s and 1920s, whose descendants today still cultivate the same fields. The men who went to Leverville and did not come home have no monument. Their bones are not at Port Sunlight. They are not at Bromborough Pool. They are in unmarked ground in the Kwilu, under the same forest from which their palm nuts were cut. The strangest part of the Leverville story is its quietness in Britain. For most of the 20th century, the conditions in the Lever-Congo Concession were not part of the public knowledge of Lever brothers, or, after 1929, of Unilever. The story re-emerged into English language scholarship only in 2008, when Verso published the English translation of Marshall's work. By then, the parent company had spent decades constructing a public image of itself as a leader in corporate social responsibility. The reconciliation of that image with the Marshall record is a process that has occupied the corporation and its critics ever since. But Leverville was not the only place where Lever's paternalism was tested in those years. There was a second test, much closer to home, on a Scottish island Lever bought after the First World War. It was the first place where his villagers said no. Chapter 8. The King of Lewis Nobody Voted For. In 1918, Lever bought an island for £143,000 and assumed its people came with it. The island was Lewis, the largest of the Outer Hebrides. The seller was the Matheson family, descendants of the early 19th century opium trader Sir James Matheson, who had bought Lewis in 1844 with a fortune made in Jardine Matheson and Company of Canton. The Matheson tenure had been controversial. Sir James had cleared crofters from their townships to make way for sheep farms in the 1850s and 1860s. The crofters had resisted. The Highland Land League had agitated for tenure rights. The Crofters Holdings Scotland Act of 1886 had eventually guaranteed those rights in law. By the time Lewis came up for sale in 1918, the island's tenancy structure was a complex mixture of large sheep farms and small protected crofts. Lever did not study the structure carefully. He saw the island as a project. The First World War was ending. He had made money during the war on soap, glycerin and food. He had been raised to the peerage as Baron Leverhulme in 1917. He was 67 years old, recently widowed by the death of Elizabeth in 1913, and looking for a final, ambitious project to which he could give his name. A friend, the steel magnate Sir Joseph Maclay, had mentioned that the island of Lewis was for sale. Lever sent his solicitor to inspect. The solicitor reported back favourably. Lever paid £143,000 in cash. In the spring of 1919, he added the whole of Harris in 2 transactions for £20,000 for South Harris and £36,000 for North Harris. He moved into Lewes Castle, the Gothic mansion the Mathesons had built outside Stornoway in the 1840s, and announced his plan. He proposed to industrialise the islands. The herring fisheries off the Hebridean coast were among the richest in Europe. They had been worked for centuries by Scottish, Cornish and Dutch fleets in summer. Lever proposed to mechanise the local fleet, build canning factories at Stornoway, and at the southern Harris port of Obe, lay a network of refrigerated rail terminals at the British ports of arrival, and open a national chain of fishmonger shops on every British high street under the brand McFisheries. He renamed Obe as Leverburg. He commissioned plans for a new harbour. He sent prospecting teams to identify factory sites. He bought trawlers. He purchased fishing rights. He hired managers. He paid roughly £2 million into the project between 1919 and 1923. By any measure of capital investment, the Western Isles project was Lever's largest single undertaking. It was larger, by capital, than Port Sunlight had been in its early years. It collapsed within 4 years. The reasons were several, and the local one is the most important. The crofters of Lewis did not want it. Almost 10,000 Lewis men had served in the First World War, in the Seaforth Highlanders, the Cameron Highlanders, the Royal Naval Reserve, and the Lovat Scouts. They had served at Gallipoli, at the Somme, at Lewes, and at Ypres. They had served in the destroyer fleets at Jutland. They had come home in 1918 and 1919 with the assumption, fed by wartime promises from London, that the post-war settlement would include land. Specifically, they had been promised crofts. The standard Hebridean dream of the returning servicemen was a small holding of their own. a few acres for cattle, a fishing boat in the bay, a small house. The dream did not include working a factory shift at a fish canning plant on the south of Harris for a Lancashire industrialist. Lever did not understand this. He thought, in good faith, that he was offering the islanders a better life. He had built Port Sunlight. He had built Christ Church. He had built the Gladstone Theatre. He proposed to build a Hebridean Port Sunlight. He could not understand why the islanders did not want it. He told them, at public meetings in Stornoway Town Hall, that the smell of fish in Stornoway would soon be the smell of soap in Port Sunlight, the smell of prosperity. The islanders listened politely and went home to their crofts. The conflict came in 1919. Returning servicemen at Cole, Gress and Tong on the east coast of Lewis occupied land owned by Lever's farms. They built turf huts. They drove cattle onto the pasture. They informed the local sheriff that they were claiming the land under the right of crofters. The farms they had raided were not in fact suitable for the industrial fishing scheme. Lever could have given them up. He did not. He believed it would set a precedent. He sent emergency telegrams to the Scottish office and demanded that the land raiders be evicted. The Scottish office was sympathetic to Lever, but politically nervous. The Liberal Secretary for Scotland was Robert Munro, MP for the Wick Burghs. Munro tried to negotiate. He arranged meetings between Lever and the leaders of the raiders. He arranged hearings before the Scottish Land Court. The Land Court ruled in favour of the raiders. Lever appealed. The appeal was rejected. By 1920, the land raids had spread to more than a dozen sites across Lewis. Lever made a final attempt. In February of 1920, he announced at a public meeting in Stornoway that he was ceasing development work on Lewis and would concentrate his future investment on Harris, where the land raids had not occurred. He withdrew managers, paused construction at the Stornoway canning plant, and shifted his attention south. He intensified the work at Liverpool. He invested heavily in the new harbour. He brought ice plants from Norway. He bought fishing rights in the Minch. The Harris project lasted 3 more years. It failed for different reasons. The herring market itself was in long-term decline. Refrigeration was developing fast, which meant that distant European fleets could now compete with the Hebridean ones for fresh fish at British ports. Russian and Baltic ports were back in supply after the end of the war. The German market for kippered herring, which had been a Scottish staple, had collapsed under the post-war German economic crisis. The McFisheries shops in Britain opened, but the supply chain from Harris struggled to keep up. The price the company could realise per tonne of fish landed at Leverville was insufficient to recover the harbour investment. Lever continued to spend. By 1923, he had committed roughly £2 million in capital to the islands. His own auditors warned him that the project would not pay back. He continued. His personal commitment to the islands was now far beyond commercial. He had been raised to the second peerage as Viscount Lever of the Western Isles in 1922, the formal recognition of his Hebridean role. He had begun to refer to himself, in private letters, as the Chief of the Islands. The islanders called him many things, none of them chief. In May 1923, in a gesture that has divided Hebridean opinion ever since, Lever announced that he would gift the parish of Stornoway and 25,000 acres of surrounding land to the inhabitants of the parish, free of charge, in perpetuity. The land would be administered by an elected trust of local residents. The Stornoway Trust came into existence in 1923 and has remained the largest community landowner in Scotland ever since. The gift was sincere, but it was also a way of cutting losses. Lever was offering the parish what the islanders had effectively already taken. The rest of Lewis he sold off in small lots from 1923 onward. Harris remained nominally his at his death. The Western Isles project, in commercial terms, ended with his death in 1925. Within weeks, the Lever Brothers Board ordered all development on Harris to stop. Leverburg became a small fishing village. The harbour was never completed. The Norwegian ice plant was sold. The canning factories were dismantled. The trawlers were sold off. The McFisheries chain survived, eventually growing to over 400 shops, but it never depended on Hebridean fish for its supply. The Lewis story is the strangest in the Lever life. It is the only one in which his paternalism met a population that had, by law, the right to refuse him. The Congolese had no such right. The Port Sunlight workers had no real alternative. The Lewis crofters did. They had served their country. They had a recent Act of Parliament behind them. They had their own Gaelic language, their own kirk, their own moral universe. They looked at the most successful industrialist in the British Empire, and they declined to be improved by him. It was a refusal Lever never recovered from. By the time Leverburg was abandoned, he was an old man. He had buried his wife. He had buried his pride at the hand of a population of returning Scottish servicemen. And he had committed his company, in the autumn of 1920, to an act of corporate hubris that nearly destroyed it. Chapter 9. The Niger Company Disaster. In 1920, Lever paid £8 million for a company at the wrong moment of the wrong cycle. The company was the Niger Company Limited, the largest British palm oil trading house in West Africa. It controlled a network of trading stations along the Niger River, the Cross River, and the Benue. It owned wharves at Bonny, Calabar, Lagos, and Barutu. It owned shipping. It owned credit lines into the local palm oil farmers of southern Nigeria. It bought, processed, shipped, and exported the bulk of the British market's Nigerian palm oil. It was, on paper, a near-perfect strategic acquisition for Lever Brothers, which was at that moment desperately short of West African palm oil to feed its expanding soap factories. The trouble was the timing. The First World War had ended in November of 1918. The 2 years that followed saw the largest commodity price boom in recorded modern history to that point. Pent-up demand from the wartime years, combined with disrupted supply chains, drove prices for palm oil, copra, sugar, cocoa, rubber, hides and grains to extraordinary peaks in the summer and autumn of 1919 and the early months of 1920. The Niger Company's share price reflected the boom. So did its asking price. Lever bought at the top. The transaction was completed in March of 1920. The price was £8 million in cash and Lever Brothers shares against the Niger Company's net assets, after the boom revaluations, of approximately £7.5 million. The Lever Brothers board had been reluctant. Lever himself had pushed the deal through. He believed that vertical integration into Nigerian palm oil was essential to the long-term position of the soap business. He believed that the boom prices would hold. He believed that the prudent course was to act fast and absorb the leading West African trader before the German and Dutch competition did. The boom broke. Commodity prices peaked in the summer of 1920 and collapsed by the autumn. By the end of 1920, palm oil prices had fallen by roughly 60% from their March peak. Cocoa, copra, rubber, and sugar followed. The Niger Company's stockpiles of palm oil, acquired at the top of the market, were now worth far less than the book value at which Lever had bought them. The trading stations were full of inventory that was depreciating by the week. The shipping was sailing half empty. The credit lines to the local palm oil farmers, denominated in pounds, were collapsing as the price of the oil itself fell. Lever Brothers faced ruin. The Niger Company purchase had been partly funded by company cash and partly by bank borrowings. The borrowings now exceeded the value of what had been bought. The published Lever Brothers accounts of 1921 showed a sharp decline in profitability. The unpublished private letters of the directors showed something worse. By the spring of 1921, the company was within weeks of insolvency. The rescue was organised by Sir Frederick Macmillan, by the senior partner of the company's solicitors, by Darcy Cooper, who would later become the second chairman of Lever Brothers, and by Lever's principal banker at Barclays Bank. An emergency overdraft of £8 million was extended by Barclays in the autumn of 1921, on terms that effectively required Lever Brothers to restructure its boardroom. Darcy Cooper was appointed to the senior managerial position. Lever, the founder, was eased away from the day-to-day decisions. He remained chairman and the public face of the company. He no longer ran it. Lever took the change with apparent equanimity. He kept his office. He kept his title. He kept his car and chauffeur. He kept his houses, his collection, his correspondence, his ceremonial role. But his power was gone. In meetings of the board from 1922 onward, decisions were taken with reference to Sir Darcy Cooper, not to Lever. The new chairman of the working committee, Francis Darcy Cooper, was an accountant of austere habits and patient temperament who had been brought in to put the company on its feet. He was, in many ways, the opposite of Lever in style. He was quiet. He was conservative. He distrusted ambitious foreign concessions. He believed in shareholder returns and prudent reserves. He believed in growth by acquisition of working competitors, not by the founding of new colonies in the rainforest. Cooper's first achievements were practical. He renegotiated the Barclays overdraft. He sold off the worst of the Niger Company stockpiles at a loss. He rationalised the company's overseas operations. He postponed expansion in West Africa. He reviewed the Western Isles project and, although he could not formally close it while Lever lived, he ensured that no further capital was committed to Harris. He examined the books of the Huileries du Congo Belge and concluded that the operation, while it was producing oil, was producing it at high political and reputational cost. Lever's last years were therefore lived under management he no longer controlled. He spent more time at Thornton Manor. He commissioned a large stone porch at the Lady Lever Art Gallery. He travelled, including the late inspection of the Congo plantations in early 1925. He worked on his correspondence. He gave occasional public lectures, including a memorable address at the Royal Society of Arts in 1923, in which he defended the principle of paternalistic capitalism against the new socialism of the Labour Party. He kept up his correspondence with Lloyd George, with whom he had been on friendly terms during the war, and with King Albert of the Belgians, with whom he had remained close. But the company was no longer his. The empire was no longer his. The Congo was being quietly managed without his daily attention. The Western Isles were beyond him. Port Sunlight was running smoothly enough that it did not need him. Inside the largest soap company in the world, the man who had founded it was now an honoured ornament. He may have known. He may not have. He never wrote about it. When does empire become a man's downfall? It became Lever's downfall in 1920, when he paid £8 million for a company in a market that was about to collapse and required a rescue that placed him outside the daily running of his own creation. He had 5 years of life still ahead of him. Those 5 years would carry him to the Congo and back, to a final inspection of Liverville, to a final lecture circuit on the philosophy of paternalism, and to a quiet death from pneumonia on the 7th of May, 1925. The funeral that followed would be the largest industrial funeral in British history. It would also be the moment at which the contradictions of his career stopped being managed by him and started being managed by everyone else. Chapter 10. The funeral that stopped the factories. On the 7th of May 1925, every soap kettle on the Wirral went silent. Lever had been ill for 2 weeks. He had returned from the Congo in late February, exhausted by the heat at Leverville and Elizabetha, and had complained on the boat home of chest pain. The ship's doctor had diagnosed bronchitis. The diagnosis at the Hill in Hampstead by his London physician Sir Thomas Horder was double pneumonia. He died at 6:20 in the morning on the 7th of May. He was 73. The last thing he was said to have done the previous evening was to read aloud a passage from the Psalms. The arrangements were made by his son William Hesketh Lever, 2nd Viscount Leverhulme, and by Darcy Cooper. The body was taken from Hampstead by private train to the Cheshire Line station nearest to Thornton Manor. From the station, it was driven by motor hearse to Thornton, where it lay for a night in the Great Hall under candlelight. The following morning, the cortege drove down the lanes to Port Sunlight. The Wirral villages turned out along the roadside, 6 and 7 deep, with caps in hand. The Lever Brothers factory closed for the day, the only full day of closure in its 37-year history to that point. The choir of the works sang in the lane. The funeral service was held at Christ Church, Port Sunlight. The church was full. The pallbearers included Darcy Cooper, Sir Robert Mond, Lord Riddell, and Lever's nephew William Lever Jr. The address was given by the Reverend John Crowlsmith, the village's senior Congregationalist minister, who described Lever as a man who had loved his workers and his country and his God in equal measure. After the service, the coffin was carried to the small mortuary chapel beside the church, where Elizabeth had lain since 1913. Lever was buried beside her. The 2 graves are marked by a single low stone tomb with the inscription of his title and her name. The press coverage was extensive. The Times wrote, on the 8th of May, that Lord Leverhulme was the greatest industrial figure of his age. The Manchester Guardian wrote that he had built the most ambitious workers' village in the world. The Daily Mail, which 18 years earlier had been forced to pay him £50,000 for libel, wrote a respectful obituary that did not mention the case. The Stornoway Gazette wrote a more cautious notice, acknowledging the gift of the parish lands, but also noting that many crofters were relieved at the prospect of being free of him. The Belgian Soir wrote an emotional obituary. The Belgian Congo papers, where they reached the European settlement at Leopoldville, wrote of the loss of a benefactor. Within weeks, the company began to dismantle what Lever could no longer defend. The Lever Brothers Board ordered all development on Harris to stop. The Stornoway Trust took possession of the gifted lands. The Lewis sheep farms were sold off in lots. The Norwegian ice plant at Leverburg was sold. The harbour works were abandoned. By the end of 1925, Leverburg was a small fishing village again. The Hebridean experiment was over. At the Congo, the company quietly continued. The Huileries du Congo Belge had a new general manager, who reported to Darcy Cooper. The Belgian colonial administration continued its labour supply policies. The plantations expanded. The mill at Leverville produced more palm oil in 1927 than it had in any previous year. The quotas continued. The criminal penalties for missed quotas continued. The deaths in the work camps continued. The structures Lever had set up in 1911 continued to operate. They simply did so without their founder. At Port Sunlight, life carried on as if Lever had merely left for a long journey. The factory ran. The cottages were occupied. The schools held lessons. The Lady Lever Art Gallery was open every Saturday afternoon. The Bridge Inn served beer. The Gladstone Theatre staged amateur plays. The new 2nd Viscount, William Hesketh Lever, lived at Thornton Manor and acted as patron of village functions, but he did not run the company. His role, like his mother's before him, was ceremonial. The men who ran Lever Brothers were now Cooper and his successors. The will was published in the autumn. Lever's personal estate, sworn for probate, was £1,625,494. The company holdings were separate and very much larger. The will divided the personal estate between his son, his charitable trust, and a small number of specific bequests. The Lady Lever Art Gallery and the bulk of his art collection were given to the public. The Lever brothers' shares were left in trust for the family. The Leverhulme Trust, the charitable foundation he had set up in 1925, shortly before his death, received an endowment funded from his personal shareholdings and tasked with making grants in education and research. The Leverhulme Trust still operates, makes grants of more than £100 million a year in research funding, and has its London headquarters at 1 Pemberton Row. The funeral, in this sense, was a transfer. The man who had been the empire was gone. The empire he had been was now several different things, held by several different parties. The village was a national heritage site in waiting. The gallery was a national museum. The Hebridean lands were a community trust. The Congo plantations were a Belgian colonial operation. The soap brands were a transnational consumer business, soon to be merged. The Bolton boyhood, the cold baths, the open-air bedroom, the Sunday chapel, the long cash book of the grocer's apprentice, were now history. There was no longer one balance sheet at the centre of the story. There were several. Each carried part of his ledger forward. None carried it whole. The largest of those parts, the consumer goods business, was about to be merged with a Dutch company in a way that would absorb the name Lever Brothers into a much bigger entity. The merger would also, perhaps not by accident, make it considerably harder for any single inheritor of Lever's legacy to be held to account for any single part of his story. Chapter 11. The Merger That Hid the Story. 4 years after Lever's death, his company joined a Dutch margarine combine and disappeared into Unilever. The merger was completed in September of 1929. The British arm was reorganised as Lever Brothers and Unilever Limited, with its head office in London. The Dutch arm was reorganised as Unilever NV, with its head office in Rotterdam. The two parent companies shared the same board of directors, the same operational divisions and the same brands, but were taxed in their respective domiciles and answered to their respective stock exchanges. The dual structure was a deliberate compromise, designed to protect the Dutch tax position of the Margarine Uni shareholders and the British tax position of the Lever Brothers shareholders, at a time when European corporate law had no equivalent of the modern cross-border merger. The combined company on its first day was the largest consumer goods business in the world. It employed roughly 250,000 people across more than 50 countries. It owned over 50 branded products, including Sunlight, Lifebuoy, Lux, Pears, Vinolia, Persil in Britain, Stork Margarine, Blue Band Margarine, Solo Margarine, and many smaller national brands. It owned trading stations along the entire West African coast. It owned the Huileries du Congo Belge. It owned the Niger Company. It owned plantations in the Solomon Islands, in Java, in Sumatra, in Malaya, and in Ceylon. It owned shipping. It owned soap factories in Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, the United States, Australia, Argentina, South Africa, India, and Japan. It also owned by inheritance the moral inheritance of Lever Brothers in the Congo. That inheritance was now distributed across the two parent companies. It was no longer the personal liability of a single industrialist. It was the corporate liability of a transnational conglomerate. The dilution of moral responsibility which is so common a feature of modern multinationals, can be dated, in the Lever case, to September 1929. There was no longer one man whose statue could be petitioned. There was a company whose press office could be telephoned. The Huileries du Congo Belge continued under Unilever ownership through the 1930s. The labour regime remained essentially the same. The criminal penalty for missing palm nut quotas, introduced in 1922, was modified in 1933, but not abolished. Conditions in the work camps slowly improved as Belgian colonial public health expanded. Wages slowly rose. Sleeping sickness declined as treatment improved. By the late 1930s, the death rates at Leverville and the other circles had fallen significantly from their disastrous peaks. But the structure of compelled labour, mediated through chiefs and reinforced by criminal law, remained. The Second World War changed the Congolese position again. With Belgium occupied by Germany from 1940, the Congo became a critical supplier of strategic materials to the Allies, including palm oil for the British war effort. The labour regime tightened. Quotas were raised. The end of the war in 1945 brought renewed pressure for reform. The criminal penalty for missing quotas was formally abolished by Belgian decree in 1947. The full transition to free wage labour came in stages through the 1950s. Congolese independence in June of 1960 triggered a final restructuring of the colonial economy. Unilever continued to own the Congo plantations under the renamed company Plantations Lever au Zaïre, then Plantations et Huileries du Congo, through the Mobutu era and beyond. In 2009, in the wake of declining returns, increasing political risk, and the publication in English of Jules Marchal's work the previous year, Unilever sold its remaining Congolese plantations to the Canadian agribusiness Feronia Incorporated. The sale price was modest. The new owners undertook commitments to improve conditions on the plantations. Subsequent reports by the Oakland Institute, Human Rights Watch, and the Réseau d'information et d'appui aux ONG Nationales found that conditions on the plantations had improved in some respects, but that long-standing land disputes, low wages, and violent security incidents continued. Several plantation workers were killed during protests in 2011 and 2015. The legacy of Lever's original concession of 1911, in modified form, continued more than 100 years after his signature in the Royal Palace at Brussels. At Port Sunlight, the merger had a different effect. The village was not part of the new combined business in any direct sense. It was an asset of Lever Brothers Limited, then of Unilever, but its day-to-day operation was a matter for a separate village trust and the Lever Brothers Village Committee. The cottages remained company tenancies. The factory continued to make soap. The Lady Lever Art Gallery received occasional acquisitions from the family, but was largely as Lever had left it. The temperance rule at the Bridge Inn lapsed slowly. The welfare officer system declined through the 1930s and disappeared during the Second World War, when the female workers it relied on entered the war factories. From the early 1960s onward, Unilever began to sell off individual cottages to sitting tenants and to outsiders. The reasoning was financial. The cottages were a large asset. They were also, increasingly, a maintenance burden. Selling them to the people who lived in them released capital and reduced costs. The first cottages were sold in 1980. The process accelerated through the 1980s and 1990s. By 2000, the majority of Port Sunlight cottages were in private ownership. The village conservation area, designated in 1978, preserved the appearance but transferred the substance. The Lever Brothers' tenancy clauses that had so dominated village life until the Second World War were gone. The village was now a desirable conservation area on the Wirral, attractive to commuters into Liverpool. the Lady Lever Art Gallery was transferred to the nation in 1978, along with most of the rest of the village's public buildings. It is now run by National Museums, Liverpool. The interpretive panels in the gallery have, since the publication of Marshall in 2008, increasingly addressed the Congo question. The Port Sunlight Village Trust, which administers many of the public buildings, published in 1999 its first commissioned booklet on Lever and the Belgian Congo. A second edition appeared in 2022. The contested statues of Lever in Bolton, in Liverpool, and at Port Sunlight have been the subject of public petitions through the 2010s and 2020s. The Liverpool City Council reviewed the Cunard Building statue in 2020 and 2021 as part of a wider citywide review of imperial statues following the Black Lives Matter protests. The statue remains in place. How does a single moral problem survive its inventor by 100 years? It survives because the corporate structures that inherit it are designed to outlive any single founder, and because the products of the original sin continue to be sold under different names. Sunlight Soap, the original bar of 1984, was still sold in 2026 in dozens of countries, principally in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, as a Unilever brand. The factory at Port Sunlight still makes soap. The forests at Leverville have been logged and replanted and logged again by Unilever, then by Feronia, then by the present owner. The story did not end with Lever. It did not end with the merger. It may not end yet. Chapter 12. 2 Villages, 1 Balance Sheet. Today, you can walk through one of Lever's villages on the Wirral and read the panels at the gallery. The walk takes about an hour. You begin at the Port Sunlight Museum, which is housed in the former village hospital. You walk down the central avenue, past the bowling green, past the Hume Hall dining rooms, past Christ Church and the small mortuary chapel where the Levers are buried. You turn into one of the side streets, where the cottages are now private homes with potted geraniums in the doorways. You walk past Lever Brothers Soap Works, still operating under Unilever, the steam from the soap kettles drifting over the brick wall, as it has done since 1888. You finish at the Lady Lever Art Gallery, with its Rossettis and its Wedgwoods and its Reynolds portraits. The interpretive panels at the gallery have changed since 2008. They now include, in the introductory rooms, an honest account of the Huileries du Congo Belge. There is a panel on the Belgian Concession of 1911. There is a panel on the Labour regime at Leverville. There is a quotation from Jules Marchal. There is a photograph, sourced from the Lever archives, of a line of African workers waiting at the company mill for their tags. There is a reference to the modern plantations et Huileries du Congo and to the deaths of workers there in 2011 and 2015. There is a discreet acknowledgement that the gallery you are about to enter was funded by the same balance sheet that funded the mill. In Lusanga, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the former Liverville is now the site of the Lusanga International Research Center for Art and Economic Inequality. The center was established in 2017 by the Dutch curator Renzo Martins in partnership with a local cooperative of plantation workers and small farmers. Its premises occupy a building on what was once the Lever Brothers compound. The center exhibits African art and seeks to repatriate, in moral terms, some of the cultural capital that Lever's collection at the Lady Lever Art Gallery embodies. It has hosted exhibitions in London, New York, Amsterdam, and Kinshasa. It is, in its modest way, the closest thing the Congo has to a settlement of the Lever account. The statues remain. The statue at the Cunard Building in Liverpool, raised in 1930, stands in the entrance hall in white marble. The statue in Sefton Park, raised in 1931, stands at the corner of one of the main avenues. The statue at Bolton Town Centre, raised in 1932 by the borough of Bolton in gratitude for Lever's bequests, stands in front of the central library that bears his name. The statue at Port Sunlight itself, raised in 1930 in front of the Lady Lever Art Gallery, looks south down the central avenue. Each has been petitioned for removal at least once during the 2010s and 2020s. Each has been reviewed by the local authority. Each has been kept in place, sometimes with new interpretive plaques nearby. Bolton retains his birthplace at 16 Wood Street with its plaque. Bolton retains his school. Bolton retains the Leverville Hospital, the public swimming bath, the library, and the park that he funded out of his own pocket. There are, in Bolton alone, more public buildings funded by Lever than by any other single benefactor in the town's history. The townspeople, in surveys conducted in 2021 and 2023, supported the retention of his statue by a margin of roughly 2-1. The Stornoway Trust remains. 25,000 acres of the parish of Stornoway, gifted by Lever in 1923, remain the property of a trust elected by the residents. The trust manages the land for the benefit of local crofters, businesses, and community projects. It is by some measures the largest community land trust in Europe. Lever's name is rarely mentioned in its statements. The land is administered as if it had always belonged to the people of Stornoway. In a sense, it always had. At Leverburg-on-Harris, the harbour is small, the wharves are limited, the ice plant is gone. The village has perhaps 300 residents. There is a ferry to North Uist that uses the harbour twice a day. The name remains. There is no statue. The Leverville Trust, founded out of his personal will in 1925, continues to make grants. It has, over the 100 years since its founding, given more than £2 billion in research grants to British universities and individual scholars. Its endowment is mostly held in Unilever shares. Its grants have supported research in archaeology, history, philosophy, biology, physics, and the social sciences. Its programme review of 2024 announced that the Trust would, for the first time, fund a major research project into the colonial history of its founder's company. The project, which is currently in progress, is being conducted by historians at the universities of Glasgow, Liverpool, and Lubumbashi. The Liverpool factory makes soap. The Sunlight brand is still sold, principally in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Lifebuoy is still sold. Lux is still sold. The carbolic smell of the original Lifebuoy bar can still be bought, although the wartime red carton has long since gone. Pear's soap, acquired in 1917, is still sold. The unbroken commercial line from the £4,000 lease at Warrington in 1884 to the modern Unilever balance sheet runs for nearly a century and a half and includes both the Stornoway gift and the Leverville quotas in its books. What does this story finally reveal? It reveals that grandeur of any kind, on the scale Lever practiced it, is built on costs that are not all visible from the front gate. The Sunlight bar in the British nursery, the pre-Raphaelite painting in the Lady Lever Art Gallery, the open-air bedroom at Thornton Manor, the Wedgwood jasperware, the Lewis Crofts, gifted in 1923, the village of 700 cottages on the Wirral, the soap kettles humming behind their brick walls. All of these are real. All of them are still here. And all of them came partly out of a balance sheet that also included men in barracks at Leverville with metal tags on their wrists. The two villages, the Model 1 and the Labour camp, were the same company. They were planned, financed, accounted for, and managed by the same head office. They were defended in the same boardroom by the same men. This is not, in the end, a story about a Bolton grocer who turned bad. He did not turn bad. He never did. He believed, with absolute conviction, to the moment of his death, that the gospel of soap was the gospel of civilization. He believed in his Congolese mill the way he believed in his Wirral cottage. He died with that account on the books of his memory. The cost of that belief, multiplied by his energy, by his cash, by his autocracy, and by his empire, is what the panels at the Lady Lever Art Gallery now invite you to count. You may walk through the gallery and admire the paintings. The men at Leverville did not have that privilege. They do not now. Their grandchildren cultivate cassava on the same red earth from which their grandfathers' palm nuts were cut. You may sit on a bench beside Christ Church, Port Sunlight, and read the inscription on the founder's tomb. You may not, anywhere in Lusanga, sit on a comparable bench and read a comparable inscription. The grandeur of the Wirral is preserved. The grandeur of the rainforest is silent. The single balance sheet that produced them both is no longer kept by a single hand. There is no longer a single account to settle. There may be, in the end, no possible final accounting at all. If you have stayed with me through these 12 chapters, subscribe so the next story does not pass you by. And I want to hear from you. Tell me where you are watching from, and tell me whether you think a man like William Hesketh Lever should be remembered as the king of sunlight soap or as the founder of Leverville. Both names are true. The question is,